intellectuals in leaping on the democratization bandwagon, but some failed to do so. 99%. Asked why they thought the United States invaded Iraq, 1% felt that the goal was to bring democracy, and 5% that the goal was to assist the Iraqi people. Most of the rest assumed that the goal was to take control of Iraq's resources and to reorganize the Middle East in U.S. and Israeli interests. The conspiracy theory, derided by rational Westerners, who understand that Washington and London would have been just as dedicated to the liberation of Iraq if its chief exports happened to be lettuce and pickles rather than petroleum. The irrationality and backwardness of the people of the Middle East has repeatedly been demonstrated, once again in September 2005, when the White House sent public relations specialist Karen Hughes to explain to them that they failed to understand Washington's dedication to their welfare and freedom. But her "I'm a mom" exercise in public diplomacy did not work too well. The problem, the press explained, was that she kept to concise sound bites rather than sustained arguments. In American campaigns, such messages repeated over and over can have an effect, because a presidential candidate dominates the news with every statement he makes, and if that fails to work, money can be poured into saturation advertising. By contrast, in the lively and percussive environment of this region, Ms. Hughes came nowhere near the commanding heights of the media. In brief, soundbites, media amplification, and saturation advertising are not effective among primitive people, who think that sustained argument and lively discussion are components of democracy. The lesson is apparently not easy to learn. At a debate at the American University in Beirut a few weeks later, Juliet Wurr, the public affairs officer at the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon, explained to the audience that the United States seeks to reach out to people in order to achieve U.S. policy objectives by promoting the 4 E's: exchange, engagement, education, and empowerment. Apparently, that fell flat in Beirut, where the environment has long been particularly lively and percussive. The task of democracy promotion is plainly a difficult one.
Audio Renaissance presents Failed States: The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy by Noam Chomsky. Read for you by Alan Sklar with Rick Adamson.
Still, Richard Norton is a bit unfair to scholarship. Some scholars did recognize that it was only after the single question had been definitively answered the wrong way that President George W. Bush and Prime Minister Tony Blair began speaking passionately about the importance of bringing democracy and freedom to Iraq and the Middle East, in an after-the-fact justification of the war, which evidently cannot be taken seriously. But outside of scholarship, and almost invariably within, Norton's observation is depressingly accurate. Quite apart from the timing, faith in the conversion is a little difficult to sustain, in light of the behavior of the missionaries, barely moments before. The Bush and Blair exploits in evading the perils of democracy as they proceeded with the invasion of Iraq in 2002 have already been reviewed. This rather significant illustration aside, it is hard to recall any display of contempt for democracy as clear as the distinction between Old Europe and New Europe announced by Donald Rumsfeld during the build-up to the invasion, and eagerly taken up by commentators and the political class. The criteria distinguishing the categories were sharp, clear, and highly instructive. One distinguishing criterion illuminates the operative concept of democracy. Old Europe consists of the countries in which the government took the same stand on the war as the large majority of the population, whereas in New Europe, governments overruled even larger majorities and took orders from Crawford, Texas. Therefore, old Europe is to be disparaged, and new Europe lauded as the hope for democracy and enlightenment. The most honored representatives of New Europe were the renowned democratic figures Silvio Berlusconi and José María Aznar. Berlusconi was rewarded by a visit to the White House in recognition of the fact that 80% of the Italian population opposed the war that he endorsed, or perhaps in honor of his reconstruction of the Italian judiciary, so as to escape conviction on charges of corruption. Aznar received an even greater reward. He was invited to join Bush and Blair at the Azores summit, announcing the invasion of Iraq, shortly after polls in Spain revealed that he was backed in his support for war by 2% of the population. The display of hatred for democracy reached its peak when the government of Turkey, to general surprise, actually followed the will of 95% of the population and rejected Washington's commands to allow the U.S. military to open a front from Turkey into Iraq. Turkey was bitterly condemned in the national press for lacking democratic credentials. Colin Powell announced harsh punishment for this defection from good order. Paul Wolfowitz took the most extreme position. He berated the Turkish military for not compelling the government to follow Washington's orders, and demanded that military leaders apologize and say, "We made a mistake," by overruling virtually unanimous public opinion. "Let's figure out how we can be as helpful as possible to the Americans," they should say, thus demonstrating their understanding of democracy. No wonder he was declared idealist-in-chief, whose sole flaw might be that he is too idealistic, that his passion for the noble goals of the Iraq War might overwhelm the prudence and pragmatism that normally guide war planners. The evaluation of Wolfowitz in the elite press is instructive. His passion is the advance of democracy, Sebastian Mallaby declares in the Washington Post. In another admiring account, Andrew Bowles writes in the Financial Times that promotion of democracy has been one of the most consistent themes of his career. No evidence is cited apart from Wolfowitz's self-image. Praising Wolfowitz's qualifications to take over as the new head of the World Bank in 2005, Mallaby writes that his main exposure to development comes from his time as ambassador to Indonesia, which combined miraculous poverty reduction with state intervention. And his experience in Indonesia will be particularly significant because of the new consensus in Washington that holds that the chief challenge in poor countries is to fight the corruption that deters private investment and to create the rule of law. A look at the actual record is revealing. Jeffrey Winters, an academic specialist on Indonesia, writes that Wolfowitz's main achievement in the economic sphere as ambassador to Indonesia was to help set the stage for the 1997 collapse of the Indonesian economy under Suharto, a tragedy that plunged tens of millions into abject poverty. Wolfowitz's most important initiative was to sponsor one of the most reckless deregulations of a banking sector ever undertaken, which led to economic collapse and widespread misery. Suharto, Wolfowitz's favorite, meanwhile earned the dubious title of being the most corrupt world leader in recent history, a clear winner according to British-based Transparency International, having amassed a family fortune estimated at anything between $15 billion and $35 billion US dollars, far outstripping second place Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, and third place Mobutu Sese Seko of Congo, also members in good standing in the rogues gallery of the administrations in which Wolfowitz served. Wolfowitz has further credentials in development, having been the architect of post-war reconstruction in Iraq, which Transparency International warned could become the biggest corruption scandal in history if strict anti-bribery measures are not adopted rapidly. They were not, and the prediction is well on its way to verification, as we have seen. Clearly, Wolfie, as GWB affectionately calls him, has impressive qualifications to carry forward the new consensus on fighting